Welcome to another episode of The Communicative Leader. I'm your host, Dr. Leah O, and today we have the pleasure of speaking with Richard Reid, a leading organizational psychologist, executive coach, and body language expert. In this episode, The Charismatic Edge, Mastering the Science of Influence, we're going to explore the intricate relationship between charisma and effective leadership communication. With over 20 years of experience coaching CEOs, entrepreneurs, public figures, Richard has become a sought-after expert on mastering presence and influence. His practical, science-backed approach to charisma has been featured in publications like the BBC, The Times, and Forbes, making this complex realm really accessible to everyone. Currently touring the UK with his Charisma Masterclass, Richard is helping professionals refine their impact and their presence. In today's conversation, we're going to discuss the evolution of communication in our digital landscape, including how to project charisma and make a memorable impression during virtual interactions. As Richard shares insights on body language, authenticity, and the unique challenges faced by leaders, you're going to leave equipped with some valuable tools to enhance your communication skills. So let's unlock the secrets to charisma and influence with Richard Reid. Hello, and welcome to The Communicative Leader, hosted by me, Dr. Leah O'Million-Hodges. My friends call me Dr. O. I'm a professor of communication and a leadership communication expert. On The Communicative Leader, we're working to make your work life what you want it to be. Richard, welcome. We are so excited to have you on The Communicative Leader. And before we dive into this really interesting conversation, I was hoping you could share a little bit about your journey. So you were an organizational psychologist, you're a leadership coach, an organizational consultant. Can you give us that background?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me on the show. Really good to be here. In terms of my background, it's quite a labyrinthine way that I've arrived where I have. So I started out working as a business consultant within the IT sector. So something very, very different from what I do today. And I absolutely hated it. I enjoyed the human interaction, but I absolutely hated the technical side of it. And what I tended to end up doing was almost translated between the techies and the average person. And that's where I kind of got the value from it. And I got to the point where I thought, right, I don't want to do this. I want to do something different. And I took a year out and I went traveling around the world. And I ended up sharing a tent in Patagonia with a psychiatrist from Wales. It's kind of a really odd story. And we started exchanging stories. He was on a bit of a journey, and so was I. And he said, have you ever thought about being a psychotherapist? He told me more about it, and I sort of got hooked in. And when I got back to the UK, that's what I started to do. I retrained as a psychotherapist whilst working as a business consultant, to work in evenings, studying. It was quite difficult for a while, but it was definitely worth it. So I ended up working as a psychotherapist in an area of London called Mayfair. And there's lots of sort of hedge funds and quite affluent people there. So working with them on a variety of different things, but they were starting to see the value of what I was doing with them and started to introduce me to their businesses. And I realised there were lots of transferable skills. And what I found was some of the skill was actually using different terminologies to explain the same principles. When you made it less about sort of mental health, a lot of these people let the barriers down, they opened up, and actually, indirectly, you were having mental health conversations with some of them anyway. But it was really coming at it from a business perspective. So that's really how this area sort of grew. And then I got involved in working in trauma work, did a lot of work with City London Police, with the Met Police, with Transport for London, and really started to hone my skills in that area. But essentially, I do lots of different things, but they're all really about helping individuals, helping organisations to maximise their potential. So even though they seem quite disparate things, that they do have a common thread between them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love these stories. I work, my day job, I'm a professor. I work with a lot of young adults, and there's so much pressure. They feel I've got to pick this one thing and it's got to be perfect. I'm like, nope, you're going to be on a roller coaster and you're not going to know where it goes. But when you look back, it makes sense when you kind of tie those threads together.
Absolutely. All these things that you do in life, they all come together at some point, I find. You might not always see the value or the relevance at the time, but pretty much everything I've done has served me well in some form or another.
Yeah. Excellent. So, Richard, we know that you are an expert in charisma. And this first question, nothing about some misconceptions. So, you know that you have extensive experience working with high-profile individuals. And what is the single most common misconception you continue to hear about charisma?
Well, a couple of things, but I think the first one is that charisma is something you're either born with or you're not born with it. And I think certainly it's fair to say that some people are naturally exude charisma more than others. But my belief is that all of us can move further along that continuum if it's something that we want to achieve. And there are skills that we can learn to do that. And I think it's about doing that in an authentic way. And I think, you only have to look at a lot of politicians to see that they're almost too polished and it's inauthentic. It's a kind of a one-size-fits-all approach. And that's not what I'm about at all. It's really about recognizing your uniqueness and finding the confidence to celebrate that in a meaningful way. But it starts with internal work. So it's not about, put your hands here and have eye contact in this particular way. It starts with managing your internal world. When you manage your internal world, then your body naturally manifests a representation of that. But also, you've got spare capacity to be flexible in the moment. So you're not over-consumed by your own emotions. You've got enough spare capacity to recognize the dynamics that are at play in a conversation so you can adapt and register what people need from you. Stop objectifying people and meet them where they are. And that's really what's at the heart of all of this.
Yes, I love that. It reminds me of when people are like, leaders are born, not made. I'm like, nope, throw that out. That is not the case. We learn it. It's a muscle, right? The more that we practice, the stronger that it gets. So I'm really excited to learn more of this with charisma. And so thinking of the science of charisma, can you kind of give us this background and what are some of the specific psychological principles that kind of underpin or the foundation of charisma?
So, as I said, a big part of it is about managing your internal world. And I think there are obviously lots of different models for how the brain works. The one I particularly like is the Daniel Kahneman model, which you've probably heard of, System 1 and System 2. And I think a lot of the time we're too heavily in System 1. And I think society also naturally steers us towards being in System 1 because there are so many demands on our time. Technology makes us very sort of impulse-driven as well. It's that instant gratification. So we have to work really hard to push back on that. And as much as what I do with people is about celebrating their uniqueness, it's also about challenging them and getting them to think about why am I doing these things in a particular way? Am I doing that because I've chosen it and because it best serves the situation? Or am I doing it because it's driven by impulse and it's the first thing that occurred to me? And, we need System 1. I don't want to sort of say that System 1 is a bad thing. It absolutely isn't. But we're too heavily reliant upon it and we sleepwalk through life. And then we wonder why sometimes situations work out well for us and other times they don't. It's because we're not adapting. We're objectifying situations. We're objectifying people.
Yeah. So with that, can you talk to us a little bit more about like when you're thinking about objectifying a situation or a person, what does that look like? What are we kind of thinking and what cues are we missing?
Yeah, good question. So I think when we're in those situations, quite often we're thinking about what we want to say next. We're thinking about what we want to get out of the situation, where we want to steer it. And a lot of the time we end up getting what we wish for, but we miss so much more. In other words, we're not creating something new in that conversation. But actually, if we leave an element of the unknown and we allow things to some degree to go where they naturally need to go, we learn more about other people, we learn more about ourselves, and we're more likely to reach alignment. And it's seeing people as they are, and so often we're transactional. We'll come away from a conversation, we'll know the facts of what's been said, but we don't understand the emotions that sit beneath it. And sometimes when the people we're talking to are saying what they're saying, they're not connecting with the emotions that sit beneath what they're saying. So part of being charismatic is having the spare bandwidth in the conversation. Think, what do they mean when they say that? What's driving that? And even sometimes asking those questions. What does that mean to you? What is that like?
Yeah, that's so helpful. And I like that idea of the spare bandwidth because you're right. When we don't have any extra to give, then it's all surface level. Absolutely. It's like, okay, let's follow the script that we're all so used to. And then we'll check it off and we'll move on to the next.
Yeah.
Okay, really helpful, Richard. So this next question, and this is one we've already hinted at. So we know that many people associate charisma with this innate talent, something that we're born with. And like you said, I mean, we can even notice from childhood on, some just kind of tend to shine a little bit more in these areas than others. But how much in your experience, in your work, how much of this is inherent, and how much of it is it, how do we start cultivating more if we realize this isn't our natural kind of communication style?
So I think that it's fair to say a lot of it is inherent, but equally as a society, we place great emphasis on people who are extroverts, and some extroverts absolutely are charismatic, but some again they objectify people. They're there and they entertain people, but it's to make them feel good. It's not about connection. And one of the things I try to impart to people is that charisma comes in lots of shapes and sizes. So even if you're quite shy and retiring, there are variations of charisma that play to those strengths. So if you're extremely introverted, it might be that your charisma comes out more when you're in one-to-one situations, and that is perfectly valid. I think a lot of the time people discount themselves because they're comparing themselves to those sort of really loud people. And I've certainly seen it in situations. I can think of an interview on TV in the UK, and there was Tom Jones, the singer, and Will Smith, and they were talking. It was all sort of friendly banter, but Will Smith's persona was so large, you could see somebody like Tom Jones, who you'd imagine be quite confident, physically shrinking because there was no space for him in the conversation. And this is what happens. We've got to meet people where they are and give them space to shine and to grow.
Yep. That's a really great example, because you're right. You can see this physical transformation. But on the beautiful side, when someone is feeling really good, you can see that their shoulders open up and the smile. Like, we can see it both ways. And you're right. If we're not looking for that, then it's easy to miss.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important, because for me, charisma is not just about making yourself feel good and look good. It's about creating a ripple effect in the world. And maybe that sort of sounds too grand, but it's about making other people feel good about themselves as well, but not in an inauthentic, disingenuous way. It's about getting them to feel validated, getting them to feel seen.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking. Like the gift of letting others know that you see them.
Exactly.
So let's think about some practical approaches now. So we know that charisma is science-backed. Can you give us a couple actionable strategies or exercises? I mean, this can even be like just dipping a toe for some of ours who are more introverted, whatever you think is best. But how can our listeners start implementing, some of these practices today to start to enhance their influence or their presence?
Well, I think the first thing is, you can have all the strategies in the world, but if you don't know when to apply them, then it's going to be very hit and miss. So I think for me, the first thing is about building your self-awareness. And so often you think how fast-paced life is, and in business, people are now on Zoom all the time. So you go from one meeting straight to the next. You don't have that break to walk down the corridor. All these things lend themselves towards system one, and what that means is we have less time and inclination to register the emotions that we're carrying. And so for me, the first thing is taking stock. Even if you've only got 30 seconds transition between two different meetings, registering how you are feeling in that moment. So it might be there's something that's just happened in that previous meeting you need to go back and reflect on later, or it might be simply thinking, right, I'm feeling quite stressed from that last meeting, and actually, is that going to be helpful for the next interaction that I'm going into? And if it's not, then it might be that you could apply some strategies, or at the very least, be aware of that and just be watching for where that might manifest itself. And quite often, when we've got those high emotions, we speed up. And that might mean there's a fraction less for the other person to reflect or expand before we dive back in again. So self-awareness is definitely the first thing.
Yeah.
And then
I was just making notes. I like that. I'm sorry, Richard. I was just thinking the 30 seconds, something that anyone can do, right? And we've all, even like you said, if I've got a 1 o'clock, a 2 o'clock, a 3 o'clock, 30 seconds between those meetings is enough to say, wow, that went really well. I'm optimistic, or that was a dumpster fire.
Yeah.
But I was also thinking my communication brain is saying then when I go into that next meeting to say, wow, I'm a little bit rattled from the previous one. So I think there's moments to share that vulnerability and make connections. I mean, certainly without oversharing, but it could be
Absolutely.
a nice way to influence that culture in a positive way.
Absolutely. And I'm all in favour, and again, this is, I think, ties in with charisma. A lot of people think it's about being completely polished. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's about being authentic and showing vulnerability. And actually, nobody warms to somebody who's an ice maiden. They warm to people who have got their stuff together, but also have challenges in life, either that they're working through or have worked through. When we can see something of ourselves in people, we warm to them. And, so back to your point, sometimes coming into it and saying, wow, I've just had a really tough meeting, you wouldn't believe it. It's a great way of breaking the ice. So I definitely think there's something in that for sure. And it just normalizes things and puts other people at ease as much as it helps us. So I'm a big advocate of that.
Yeah. That's so great. And I love that you raise up too that idea of vulnerability with charisma sometimes. Because you're right, the way I think that many people that knee-jerk reaction to charisma is loud. It's like jazz hands and polished.
Yeah.
But I love that it's also like, nope, I'm a real person and here are some things that I've overcome or what I'm dealing with. And thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a massive thing. I think different people will regard different people as being charismatic. But if you look at a lot of people I would regard as charismatic. So given that it's largely a US audience, if you think somebody like Oprah Winfrey, that is somebody with a serious backstory. Yep. So they've had a lot of success, but it's been a meandering journey, and she's quite honest about that. She owns it. And it's not in a victim way. It's this is what I've worked through. This is what I am working through. This is what I'm doing to work through it.
Yeah.
And that's inspiring. It's not somebody who's just saying, well, woe is me. It's somebody saying, you can do this too.
Yeah.
And people want to align with people who have that dynamism to them. So I think that's massive, and it's inspirational for people.
It is. Yeah, that's so helpful. Great example. So let's lean into sincerity. And this is something that you've kind of already touched on, because I know that sometimes people will think of charisma and they think about it as being superficial or on a darker side, even manipulative. So how do you guide your clients to develop what is authentically charismatic to them so that then they're in a position to build trust and foster genuine connection?
I think one of the big challenges for people, coming from a psychotherapy background, one of the biggest challenges for people is validation. And it's not always that they've been rejected or criticised by other people. It's a lot of times the blockers that we put in front of ourselves, that people won't accept these parts of me. So we never test the water to gauge that reaction. And one of the things that I do with a lot of my clients is we talk about personal brand. And so most people have, it's not something that a lot of people consciously think about, but they'll have some sense of themselves, what they're good at, what they like, what energizes them. And so we do an exercise around that, but we also get, in inverted commas, key stakeholders in their lives to give constructive feedback on them, what they do that works well, what it is that they bring to situations that's unique. And a lot of people find that both rewarding and disconcerting because they're not used to getting that kind of positive feedback. We don't tend to get it quite so much as adults as we do when we're kids.
Yeah.
So all of this starts to help us to get a sense of what our brand is, and your brand is almost like your North Star. When you're in situations, you can use that to plot a course, and if perhaps you deviate from that, you can recognise it far quicker and come back on track. And what we then start to do is look at small experiments that you can do where you start to reveal other aspects of that brand. It's almost like graded exposure, where you put yourself out there a little bit, not too much.
Yeah.
You get used to the discomfort of it, and you use the feedback, both the direct feedback and the reflection that you have to inform what you do with it next. So what you're doing over a period of time is gradually revealing yourself to the world, and hopefully getting that validation that says it's okay to be you. So it might not always be that people give you positive feedback about that, but equally maybe they don't give you negative feedback, and maybe that's enough. That actually it's okay. It's no big deal.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yeah, that's so helpful. And I was thinking in your response, it's so it's neat because I could see all of these threads of your previous experiences kind of come through in that response. And I think it shows, what a strength you are to everyone you work with, because you are pulling from all these different experiences and expertise to really set people up to be their best selves.
That's entirely what it's about. It's about people recognizing and celebrating their uniqueness, and all of us, however accomplished we might be, it doesn't mean that we can't polish the edges of that we shouldn't aspire to improve in certain areas. But first and foremost, it's about recognizing where you're at. And I think the people who I regard as being most charismatic are the ones who don't hide in the crowd. They might be quirky, they might be a little bit unusual, but they're memorable.
Yep.
It's that old adage, isn't it? What do people say about you when you're not in the room? We remember them. Doesn't mean we always like them, but we remember them.
Yeah. Yep. So let's shift and kind of take what we've been talking about, but then think about it in this digital landscape. So I have a few questions about that. Sure. So we know that this, the app, we're on a video call right now. We know that this is part of work. We know with FaceTime, people are just really communicating through screens very, very often for many different reasons. So I'm wondering how this shift, especially in our professional lives, to virtual meetings and online interactions, how has that impacted the way charisma is perceived and also expressed?
I think it's interesting. I think that the risk is with the shift to doing more things online is that we run the risk of things being transactional. So in other words, what are we here to discuss? Okay, we've discussed it. Okay, I'll see you later. And you think about sort of traditional ways in which people would meet. In the office, for instance, there'll be people who get there a little bit early. There'll be people that hover back at the end. There's natural opportunities to connect with people in a different way that put a context around things, that allow people to express things that maybe they don't feel confident expressing in the group. And I think that's one of the big challenges with the digital age is you don't get that extra added level of human interaction. So I think it's something that if we want to sort of develop our charisma, if we want to be inclusive, we've got to work harder at, because those environments don't naturally lend themselves to it. So one of the things is that, when you're having a meeting, generally we'll block meetings out for half an hour or an hour. Slow that meeting down. So if you meet for half an hour, have the content for 20 minutes, but have a little bit of a preamble and a slow easing out of the meeting at the end. So actually you're giving people an opportunity to share what's going on for them. And I think it's even more important with introverts because, I think it's a fact. The world is heavily stacked towards extroverts, rightly or wrongly. And you think about a lot of meetings, they're often sort of demanding quick fire responses from people. And if you're an introvert, often your natural tendency is to process internally before you put anything out there in the wider world. So actually giving people an opportunity to think in advance about things, sending an agenda for a meeting. How much time do we waste in meetings talking about things that aren't relevant? They're not connecting, and they're not about the reasons that we're there for either. So sending an agenda out before is really useful for those people. Asking a question and giving those people time to reflect on it before they give the answer is really important. And just slowing things down as well, moving away from this transactional element. How many times do we ask people a question? And again, we think about the content of the answer, but we don't allow people to reflect on what it means to them. We don't allow ourselves time to reflect on what they mean by it. And how often the people who are put on the spot say something and actually that's not their definitive answer on something. Sometimes if we just hold back a fraction, people will expand on that, or they'll readjust what they mean. What I actually mean is this.
Yes.
But we're socialised to rush things. I've got to give you a quick answer. It's got to be the right answer straight away. So for me, those are the big things that they've always been an issue. But they've been heightened through the digital age, I think.
Yeah, you're right. And you think when we're sharing the same physical space, we can sometimes it's easier to pick up on those cues when someone is, you can see they're processing and there's likely more. But when you've got 15 little boxes of colleagues' faces, it's just about impossible.
It is. It's really hard to gauge what's going on for him. You can't do that and be talking at the same time. So it does put a lot more demands on us for sure.
Mm-hmm. So let's think about, how do we make an impression then? Right. So if we know some of these challenges of trying to project charisma through a screen, what are some key elements? Like, anyone, but maybe our leaders who are charged with kind of guiding the ship. What are some things that they can focus on to make a strong impression in these virtual settings?
So I think the first thing is managing your internal world, as we've already said. So what is it that you're potentially bringing into that situation? Is that helpful? Or if it's not, thinking about what you can do differently with it. I think emotions and energy is really important. So it may well be you go into a meeting, you know the agenda, you know the content of what you want to deliver. That's fine. But actually, charisma is partly about connecting with people, how we connect with people. And the biggest way that we connect with people is around how we make them feel. You can have the most rational, compelling argument in the world, but if people don't emotionally buy into it, then actually they're not spurred to action that or share that with other people. So, it's very hard to sort of gauge what everybody might need from you. But it's worth thinking about before you go into a meeting what the intention is. What is it that I want to generate in this meeting? Not just what do I want to tell people. So, in other words, what is the energy that is going to show me in a good light, but also give people what they might need from this situation. So it might be you want people to feel excited, in which case you might think about how you use your voice. You can't see a lot of me on the screen, but you can see my face and you can see my hands. You can use those to generate energy. Or it might be people are panicked, in which case you want a slower, more methodical tone. And if you can see what I'm doing with my hands, I'm bringing them close together and they're pushing down. It's bringing the energy down. So in other words, don't worry, we've got this under control. So these are small things that we can do. And I think the other thing that I would say is really, really important. It's important in any environment, but I think it's even more important when we're in this sort of fast-paced meeting environments, is slowing down and thinking about the structure of our sentences. So shorter sentences tend to register more with people. And particularly when we're online, it's incredibly tiring for people in a way that it's not when we're in a room with them. So we need to do things to work harder to hold and to grab their attention. So shorter sentences not only allow people to more easily follow the thread of what you're saying, but it allows you to think about how to achieve maximum impact with each of those sentences. So one of the things I do with my clients, if we look at, if they're doing talks or presentations, we do an exercise where we create short sentences and we think, what is the impact that you want to make with this sentence? What's the key message? How are you going to use your voice, your body language, the choice of words to bring that alive and really, really emphasize what that point is? And it can even involve pausing. Sometimes a strategic pause can be really useful. But we don't tend to do it. We tend to rely heavily upon the words, the content to do the work for us. And as human beings, we're essentially sophisticated animals. And yes, we understand words, but first and foremost, we respond to energy, we respond to body language, we respond to sounds, all the kind of things that we're quite lazy about. They become more important in a digital age where people's concentration is far less.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so helpful. And I love the idea of helping people to recognize how many tools they have at their disposal. We haven't really thought about them as tools before. And that can be really empowering for someone to say, oh, I can actually try some things to see if it's getting the effect that I'm hoping for.
Absolutely. There are umpteen things that you can do to improve your charisma. I mean, the one word of caution I always use with people is Rome wasn't built in a day. Don't try and do all these things in one day because number one, it will feel overwhelming for you. And particularly for people who already know you, they'll think, who is this? I don't know this person. So you've got to do it over a period of time
Yep.
for you, first and foremost, to feel comfortable with it and integrate it, and to socialize and normalize it with other people. So, pick one or two things and focus on getting those right before you expand that to other things.
So we've touched on body language, and you've done such a beautiful job. I'm really thinking about my hands now as I'm talking. A beautiful job of making us aware of how we can use body language to impact charisma. I'm just wondering if there are, other elements of body language that some tips that you recommend, or if there are certain things that you say, hey, please try to avoid that, or be mindful that this one doesn't usually translate well.
Yeah. Well, I think that there are a few things we can do around this. I think that the first thing that I would say is, again, it's about moderating our energy and our impulses. A lot of the time, we for example, we nod too much. When somebody's saying something, we nod too much. And that can suggest a lack of confidence. So I'm not suggesting you stop nodding, but think about how you do that when you do that. Because it all plays into another aspect of charisma, which is gravitas. In other words, when I do things, does it seem deliberate and purposeful, and is it adding value? So I always say to people, is it adding value? Why are you doing that? Is it adding value? So things like nodding, we can nod too much. Yeah. So we need to nod to show people we're listening, and we agree if we agree, but refrain from doing it too much. So that's the first thing. Eye contact is useful, but again, in moderation. You can go too far the other way. You don't want to seem intense and like you're a serial killer. So, absolutely look at people during key points that you're making or they're making, but sometimes just look over their shoulders. You're still making sort of peripheral eye contact with them, but you're breaking that up a little bit. And certainly if you're bringing other body language elements into play as well, that also helps. If you're quite static and then you're doing intense eye movement, that can be disconcerting for people. So this is really important. Yeah. So those are the kind of things that I would say are the primary things that we should think about. But I think the other thing is, and you may be familiar with this, I'm a big advocate of Amy Cuddy's work. And Amy Cuddy talks about how we hold our bodies and how that then manifests in terms of our confidence and our decision making. So in short, she talked about how making yourself larger increases your confidence hormones, and actually when you make yourself smaller, you get an extra burst of cortisol, which is a stress hormone. And I'm a big advocate of that. So I'm not suggesting you do a big, massive power pose in the middle of a meeting, and everyone wonders what you're doing. Yeah, but in the course of a conversation, there's an ebb and flow, isn't there? And if you're perhaps talking about difficult topics, you might become over-exaggerated. You might become on the verge of becoming aggressive or angry, or you might feel slightly cowed by what's happening. So recognizing these things allows you just to adjust. Yeah. So it might be, actually, I'm getting a bit of a battering in this meeting. I'm going to feel myself getting smaller. Just breathe and open your shoulders up a little bit. Sit up. A lot of the time we start to lean forward when we're tired or when we're lacking confidence. So sitting up is another way of just, it's a pattern interrupt. It's getting the brain to reevaluate what's going on. So those are kind of my sort of top tips.
Yeah, really, really helpful. Thank you. I know that I am a super nodder, and I know that's from my time in the classroom, like validating students who are really nervous and presenting. But I do have to check myself in other contexts, like especially if I'm working with colleagues or at a professional conference. I'm like, nope, hold your head. Yeah. It's enough. Yeah. So
and it's not
but
that any of these
it's becoming
things are wrong.
Aware of it.
Yeah,
right?
It's not that any of these things are wrong.
Exactly.
But it's knowing why you're doing it. Are you doing it because that's just what you always do? Or are you doing it because actually it suits the environment?
Yes. Yeah. So this next question, Richard, is about some of your coaching. And I know you've coached CEOs, entrepreneurs, public figures. And I'm just wondering, how have you noticed, does charisma differ or stay the same across these different types of leadership roles? Are there different facets of charisma that are critical in certain aspects and not so much in others? What have you found?
Interesting question. Well, I think again, there are lots of different models of charisma, but I like the model that's been created by Olivia Fox-Cabane. She talks about 4 different types of charisma. This is where I'm going to try and remember what they are. So there's authoritative charisma, there's kindness charisma, focused charisma, and what's the other one? Kindness, warmness. It'll come to me in a minute. 4. Anyway, so the main one that a lot of business people feel in is authoritative charisma. In other words, and that's kind of the archetypal old school management way of working. And absolutely, you need some of that, but you need some of these other elements as well. Visionary was the other one I was thinking of. So warmth, focus, authoritative, and visionary. So a lot of CEOs will say, right, I understand I need authoritative. I understand that I need visionary. I don't really need the other 2. And I say to people, actually, there might be some that are more obvious than others, but actually, you need to be considering all of these areas because at different times, you need to bring different skills to bear. So it's kind of getting them to register that and thinking about your intentions. And certainly when you're in a one-on-one situation, sometimes you do want to be giving people your full focus. You do want people to feel that you care. It's not enough just to be the person who knows what to do and tells people what to do. And I think people's ideas of management are changing, but there is still that old school element. And there is that element that says, well, I've always got to project a perfect image. I can't talk about anything that's remotely vulnerable. But it's massively important because actually it sets beats the drum for how the organisation is. There's lots of organisations I've worked with, and they talk about things like culture and well-being and mental health. If you are giving out mixed messages in terms of this is what we're offering, but this is how I behave, people think, well, that's what I need to do if I want to get on in this organisation, and they don't avail themselves of some of these services. Or they suffer in silence, or worst case scenario, they think this organisation is disingenuous and I don't want to be here. So there's lots of organisations who talk about these things and they have vision and mission statements, but it's often a tick box exercise. And what I say to people is, if you are serious about these things, it starts at the top. Model the behaviours and the attitudes that you are purporting to other people. So some of that is about vulnerability. Some of that is about making people feel seen. Even if they're the most junior people, getting to know a little bit about them. Even if you're just saying hello. When you're walking around, not seeming caught up in your own thoughts and overwhelmed by everything that's going on for you, making yourself seem accessible, even if people don't necessarily need to talk to you. If you don't seem accessible because you look burdened by your own stuff, people are just going to feel like a burden if they think about coming to talk to you, so they won't. How often do people say my door's always open if people have got a problem?
Yep, exactly. All right. So, Richard, let's think about your masterclass. You're currently touring the UK with your Charisma Masterclass. What are some of your biggest aha moments or common breakthroughs that you get to witness your participants experience?
Interesting question. The first thing that comes to mind, I had a really interesting lady on one of my courses a while ago, and she was quite tall. And we did an exercise with body language where she was standing opposite somebody. And she suddenly realised that from a very early age, she'd been socialised to lower her head and her shoulders to try and fit in with everybody else who was shorter than her. And actually, one of the beautiful things about these workshops is it's a very sort of psychologically safe environment. We do a lot of exercises to build trust between people, so that actually people feel confident to offer constructive feedback, and other people take it in the vein in which it's intended. So the lady that she was working with gently pointed out to her, just pause for a moment, notice what's happening with your body right now. And the look of revelation on this woman's head, to anybody else it was obvious, but to her, from a very early age, it was about trying to fit in with the crowd. And this goes back to my point from earlier, is that this is one of the things that gets in the way of people shining, is the fear of standing out in the worst possible ways, and sometimes owning who we are
Yep.
owning what we think is so important. So for me, that was one of the biggest things that I've noticed. I guess other obvious things that come up a lot is people's need to fill the space. So people get really uncomfortable with silence, really uncomfortable with slight pauses. And what that means is they continue to talk and they miss an opportunity for something new to be created in that space. And you see this a lot with people across the board, but leaders as well. Leaders feel like they're only as valuable as the last great insight that they've made. And I think sometimes creating space, it's a way of being more inclusive, allowing other people to reflect on things, to share things. And ultimately, I think as a leader, this is what it's about. It's about bringing people with you. And actually, in an ideal world, creating people that are even more accomplished than you are. And the way that you do that is to create the space and to effectively say it's okay for you to share. It's okay for you to share thoughts that might be different or slightly unusual. And if we can't incorporate those, we're at least respectful and acknowledge those. And that's how organisations remain innovative, and it's how fresh ideas continue to grow. And if you want to be competitive, you have to bring everybody together to become more than the sum of the parts. So those are sort of
those
some
are
of the big
really
takeaways.
helpful insights. Yeah. Yeah, I was really struck by, I think you're right, that leaders oftentimes think their value is in all that they're projecting and adding, and certainly that is a large component of it. But you're right, learning to create space and leave it open
Absolutely.
can be really
and that's the
valuable.
unknown, isn't it? It's the unknown. When you don't speak, you don't know what's going to happen.
Scary.
So it's a leap of faith, but the more you do it, the more productive it is. And I remember, being a young therapist starting out thinking, I have to know everything I need to say before I get to the session. And actually, the most productive sessions are the ones where we just see what emerges and we work with what's in the room at the time. And I think, some of these principles of the therapy room can easily be translated to the boardroom with tremendous value.
Excellent. So, Richard, the last two questions for you, and this is how we end all of our episodes of the Communicative Leader, and they're connected. So, the first one is, advice, a challenge, a tip for our titled leaders out there, our managers, directors, and higher. And then the second part is just kind of that advice, tip, or challenge for employees of all ranks across all industries.
Okay. Interesting. So in terms of leaders, senior people, one of the common refrains is that they know they need to make changes, but they don't have the time. So there's no point in coming up with grand ideas because there isn't the time. And inevitably, human nature dictates that when you're under pressure, time or otherwise, you revert back to what you know best. So making big changes is really not practical in most cases. But what you can do is start to look at transitions. So going back to the point that we spoke about before, even if you've only got 30 seconds or 5 minutes between a meeting, how can you maximize that time? So in other words, first of all, reflecting on what's going on for you. Do you need to set the intention for the next meeting? Do you need to have a reset? There are lots of things that we can do to reset, but the most obvious thing that we can do, it's almost so obvious we don't think about it, is to manage our breathing. Any situation that we're in, big or small, will have some level, in some cases very low level, emotional charge for us. And that emotional charge then has a bearing upon how we breathe. So getting more in touch with our breathing, adapting our breathing is a great way of resetting the brain to really sort of draw a line on what might have gone before to give our full focus to what's coming next. And I talk about this idea of 4-4-6 breathing. So the idea is breathing in for 4, holding for 4, and breathing out for 6. And I've used it lots of times. So, for example, when I've been on television shows, they'll give you sort of 30 seconds warning during the commercial break. Right, you're on. And you feel the energy go up, that slight anxiety.
Yep.
And I use things like that as I'm walking through the cameras to go into the studio and sit on the sofa just to bring that emotion under control. It works really, really well. So that's what I would encourage leaders to do. Even if you think you've got very little time spare in the day, think about those transitions. And even if all you do is manage your breathing and set your intention for the next meeting, it can make a profound difference to how things play out. So that's my challenge for leaders and senior people. For people in general, I think it's about trying to be more mindful. So, it's always going to be a work in progress because of how busy life is and how humans operate. But start to ask yourself, why do I do the things that I do? And actually, do I do that because I've chosen to do it, or do I do that because that's how I've always done it? And a very simple example of this is how many people come in the house after a day at work and they either turn the TV on or they put the kettle on. And they do it whether they want to watch a program or whether they want a cup of tea or coffee or not. That's autopilot. So, making those small changes, it's like peeling the layers of an onion. The more you do it, the more you realize that you do it. And what it starts to do is it gives you more opportunity to manage your world and to manage your impact as well. Going back to the point about gravitas is about being deliberate and purposeful. And the more that we demonstrate that we are a serious proposition, that actually we do things for a particular impact, the more people gravitate towards, the more people take us seriously. There's research on this, for example, in terms of people walking down the street. So years ago, the Met Police in London did some research on muggings, and they got reformed muggers to stand by the side of the street and watch people and say, well, if you were still in the line of mugging, which of these people would you mug? Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because they didn't just point out the small people, the frail people. It was a variety of shapes and sizes and ages. And the conclusion they came to was that they didn't choose the people who were deliberate and purposeful because they thought they were a proposition. And if they wouldn't fight back, they'd at least cause a lot of difficulty. It wouldn't be straightforward. And they went for the people who were meandering or didn't look like they knew where they were going. And the same applies in life in general. Hopefully nobody's going to get mugged, but whether it's in business, whether it's at a party, people gravitate towards people who look like a proposition, and they afford them more respect even before they open their mouths. So have a think about that.
Yeah, that is so helpful. And I keep thinking about, too, how much we do on autopilot, as you say, and that if we take the time to reflect and become more aware, then I think you're naturally going to have some more of that bandwidth you're talking about. Be present, to have some space, right? To just really be a full participant in your life.
Absolutely. And when you're interacting with people, the more you're used to being present and mindful, the more people are going to feel valued and seen. And the more you're going to pick up on those little nuances or the mismatches in terms of what people say versus what you notice, or the fact there's an emotion that sits behind somebody's position. In different walks of life, we negotiate. You don't have to be in business to negotiate. We negotiate about all kinds of things. And people will say things, but we don't necessarily understand the emotion that sits beneath it. And if we understand that, we've got more negotiation skills and ability to influence and persuade people.
Excellent. Well, Richard, thank you for sharing your expertise with us, your time. This has been a really fascinating conversation. I know I've gotten a lot out of it, and I know our listeners will as well.
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
All right, my friends, that wraps up our conversation today. Until next time, communicate with intention and lead with purpose. I'm looking forward to chatting with you again soon on The Communicative Leader.